Morning. A little bit closer? Is that a little better? Okay. The beginning of Advent also coincides with World AIDS Day. Every year on December 1st, the world commemorates World AIDS Day. People around the world unite to show support for people living with and affected by HIV and to remember those who lost their lives to AIDS. This World AIDS Day, UN AIDS, is highlighting the urgent need to end the inequalities that drive AIDS and other pandemics around the world. Well, as many of you already know, I'm Julie Dowling, and I've been a member of United Congregational Church for over 10 years now. Today, I will share my life journey. This includes my struggle living with the AIDS virus. It is fitting for me to tell my story today because the first Sunday of Advent celebrates hope, and hope is my greatest gift from God. To begin with, I grew up in San Rafael, California. My parents are Mary and Oak Dowling. I have a younger brother, David, who's 4 years younger. We moved from the Chicago area when I was 10 years old in 1973. I went on and graduated from San Rafael High School, and then went on to San Diego State University and received my Bachelor's of Science in Nursing. I lived and worked in San Diego, and my first few jobs were as a floor nurse. I worked in orthopedics, neurology, and trauma for about 2 years, and then I specialized in public health nursing. I loved public health nursing. I made home visits and worked with maternal child health, communicable disease, particularly tuberculosis, and my district was San Isidro, which was right at the border of Mexico. I did a lot of health teaching and referral, and a lot of the time I just couldn't believe I was even paid for doing something I loved so much. I had really found my niche. It was my dream job. I loved the people I worked with, and I was really in a good place. Well, it was May of 1991, and I was 28 years old, and I was working in the public health center, drawing blood from a woman for a pregnancy test. Well, at that time, I accidentally stuck myself with a needle. Well, back in 1991, the media was talking a lot about AIDS and hepatitis C. So immediately the woman said, "Oh, don't worry, I've been tested for everything. I'm negative, you don't have to worry." So I felt a sense of relief. However, as a precautionary measure and a protocol, in the event a healthcare professional sustains a needle stick injury, you have to have a tetanus shot, which I had, a hepatitis series of tests to make sure you're immune to hepatitis A and B, and make sure you don't have hepatitis C, which I didn't have, and then a baseline HIV test, which is a blood test. So I did the test, and now you can get the results within minutes. Back then, it took an entire week to get the results. So I assumed at that time, rationally, the media, they were talking about gay men having this disease. I wasn't a gay man. I knew pretty much how you got this disease, and so I had never had a blood transfusion. I knew who my partners were, and I had never been an IV drug user, so I figured I was okay, and I was really relatively healthy. However, as each day ticked on, in 1991, AIDS was a death sentence. There was nothing you could do. So I kept thinking, what if? And I was just starting my life. I mean, you know, what about kids and getting married and all this? I mean, what, you know? The other thing that haunted me was that I was getting these fevers. I would be fine one day, the next day I'd have a fever of 103, no other symptoms, and then it would disappear the following day. And that would happen maybe twice in a month. But I thought, oh, it's probably nothing. So the day arrived for the results. Well, I went into the health center where I worked, sat in the room, and I knew the counselor, and she looked down, looked at me, kind of looked around and said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you, but you're HIV positive." Well, I was so stunned and so horrified, I couldn't even cry. I screamed. And they called my boss in, who settled me down, and she turned up the TV to muffle my cries. And she called my childhood friend who worked at a health center nearby, Lori. She came and she picked me up and took me to the doctor for the first time with an HIV positive diagnosis. Well, one of the first things they do is they do a blood test, and they check the T cells. Now, a healthy, normal person has a T cell count of about 1,000 to 1,500. So they did my T cells, and I waited for the results, thinking they'd be probably pretty good. Well, remember the T cell count that's healthy is 1,000 to 1,500? My T cells were 110. I was already in advanced AIDS. And to give you a background, an AIDS diagnosis, and basically AIDS is just advanced HIV. It's when HIV is not treated, it becomes AIDS. It's defined as less than 200 T cells and or an opportunistic infection diagnosis. And an opportunistic infection is an infection that we're all exposed to different germs, but the person with AIDS ends up contracting the disease. And that's why you hear of AIDS patients having these rare pneumonias and strange cancers. They can't fight it, and they end up contracting the disease. So I didn't have an opportunistic infection. However, I had low T cells, so I was already in AIDS. So what they knew back then, and in 1991, and from what I presented, they told me at 28 years old I had 4 years to live at the max. So I'd be 32. So I went home and did a lot of soul searching. I never did figure out how I got this. It was there, and that I had to deal with it. And I decided, well, I'm going to go back to work and just continue what I love doing and live as normal as I could. So I did, and I worked at the health center, and it didn't last too long. Until 1993, I just became too sick and had to go out on permanent disability. I was living in San Diego trying to get by, and my parents said, you know, you're just too sick. You need to move up here, move to San Rafael, and we'll take care of you for your final days. So I moved to San Rafael. Well, shortly thereafter, I ended up with my first opportunistic infection, and that was CMV retinitis, or cytomegalovirus. It came in the form of an ulcer in my esophagus, and it usually originates in the eyes. Sure enough, it was in my eyes. So there's no cure for that. The only thing they could do was surgically put in a central line, an IV in my chest, and I would give myself an IV for a half an hour every day, and that would slow the progression of the disease, but it was not a cure. So I did that every day. And the prognosis of CMV retinitis is blindness within a year and death. That's what I was looking at. So every time I gave myself this IV, I prayed. And I prayed to my Lord. I read my Bible. And I really had a close relationship with God. He sustained me. Excuse me. But I did it. And I gave myself that IV for 2 years. And I kept getting sicker and sicker and had a lot of other illnesses. Then, after 2 years, I would go into the ophthalmologist every month. He'd look into my eyes and see the same thing, and I'd go on my merry way. Well, again, it had been 2 years, and I go in to see the ophthalmologist, and he looks into my eyes, and he gets kind of nervous, and he's going through his paperwork, and then he looks at me straight in the eye, and he says, I don't understand this. There's a misdiagnosis, but the CMV's gone. It's disappeared. And I said, no, M is for miracle. And that was my first miracle. However, I had all these other things, all these other strange illnesses and wasting syndrome and shingles and you name it, I had it. So I was still pretty sick, but I had hope because that CMV had gone away and I retained my sight. So I was getting sicker living at my folks, and I was even planning my memorial service. Well, it became really too difficult for my parents to care for me, and I felt like a burden. They were trying to work and carry on their lives. So we found a residential facility or a hospice known as Henry House. And it was a 4-bedroom house at the end of a cul-de-sac in Santa Rosa. It's still there. And it housed 6 AIDS patients, and it just happened to be 5 gay men and me. So it was a new reality for me, and I kind of felt like I was in the twilight zone, but I just, after a while, I was kind of special, and they treated me really nice, and these guys became my family, and they got to know me as Snow White, and they were my dwarfs. So I was really special. However, what was really hard is to watch these guys deteriorate in front of me, physically and mentally, and there was dementia with that, and they would die. And it was like a dress rehearsal. When was it going to be my turn? Those T cells I had, they went from 110 to 8, just 8. So it was a rough time. And a lot of the people that worked at Henry House, most of them were from the LGBTQ community because there was such a stigma, and the stigma still stands, but it's better now. I mean, I remember once a nurse double-gloved to take my blood pressure. People were really afraid, and we felt like poison, So the LGBTQ community were there for us, and they worked with us at Henry House. In fact, I lived there 2.5 years, and when I look back, people say, that must have been just a horrible time. You must want to erase it out of your memory. And I say, no. I smile. I have warmth in my heart when I think of Henry House because it was a unique time. We savored the moment. It was all about the here and now. We really looked pretty scary because we were so sick, and there were IV poles and oxygen tanks and everything, but we were like souls dancing with one another. It didn't matter credentials or backgrounds. In fact, one guy had been an executive in a bank and another guy had been a landscaper. But we didn't care. It was just right now, in the moment, loving each other. When we cried all our tears. When we laughed with all of our laughter. And believe me, there was a lot of laughter. In fact, at Christmas time, I have to smile because every inch of that house was decorated. And we had ornaments and color and tinsel and lights. And right smack dab in the living room stood a big giant Christmas tree. And instead of a star at the top, there stood unapologetically a Ken Barbie doll in a lace wedding dress. It was beautiful. So I loved it, and I just smile. So approximately 1996, I had been there 2.5 years, and they came out with the protease inhibitors, which was a new medication. And I had gone through a lot of other medications that didn't really help. Well, I started taking this medicine, and from the first day, I noticed a difference. It was like a fog of death had lifted, and I started gaining 1 pound every day. My blood values became more normal. My mom said it was like watching special effects in a movie. I was transforming into myself again. Within a month, I had more energy and was taking walks. And within 6 months, I moved out of there and lived independently. The best and biggest miracle of all. Well, today, I have lived with this for 31 years. And my T cells have gone from 8 to over 800. I'm not in remission, but the virus has stopped multiplying. And as long as I take my medicine, it'll stay at bay. Unfortunately, I cannot work because by the time they found out my status, my body had already been bombarded by the virus. So I have good days and not so good days. I have severe neuropathy in my legs and feet. I have bouts and episodes of flu-like symptoms and chronic fatigue. But hey, I'm here. And, sadly, the HIV test originally was performed too late, a little late. But the nice thing is that if you know your status, especially now, you can get on the medications and live a relatively normal life. And if I hadn't accidentally stuck myself with that needle, I would not have known my status and wouldn't have been cared for as I was. So that was really divine intervention. So throughout my long struggle, my faith has remained my constant companion. I don't believe that when you die, you lose the battle. Your soul just moves on in a different form, and you meet the people who've gone before you. It wasn't my time yet. The Lord is with me every day. I feel his presence. I just feel him in every cell of my being. And in addition, my church community, family, and friends are essential to my survival. My life partner, Doug, who you haven't met, he does not have HIV, but he deals with a lot of other health issues, has not only been with me every step of the way, but he is a warrior for the cause, too. I truly believe that you need to bring meaning to your pain. When you deal with a tragedy, you have to make sense out of it. You have to turn a negative into a positive. So I said, okay, I have this disease. I have some nursing experience. I'm going to take this and make it something special. So I've really been out there for the AIDS cause and in the forefront. I'm a participant and a client at the SPAR Center, and you've heard me speak of that a lot. It's a wonderful nonprofit organization in Corte Madera that serves the HIV and AIDS population and the LGBTQ community. I serve on the board of directors there, and I've also facilitated a women's HIV support group, which has given me a lot of gratification. I've also worked at a myriad of, I've spoken at a myriad of organizations such as the Home and Garden Club and for pharmaceutical companies such as Abbott Lab. And I've also taught HIV education and told my story in the public schools, the junior high level and the senior high level. Lastly, I've been featured in the local newspaper and on NBC News even. My goal in speaking is to educate, inspire, dissolve stereotypes, and particularly to drive away stigma associated with this disease. Stigma has been our greatest obstacle and barrier. So in conclusion, as I mentioned, hope has been my greatest gift from God. And I have to say this. My motto comes from my dear mother, who says, always buy green bananas, because I will be there when they ripen. Thank you. Praise God.